Welcome to the Clear the Shelf podcast with Chris and Chris, the show that meets at the intersection of education and entertainment to discuss online arbitrage, retail arbitrage, wholesale, and all facets of selling on Amazon. We'll bring you news, tactics, strategies, insights, stories, and interviews to help you grow your Amazon business. And now, here are your hosts, Chris Grant and Chris Rasick. What's up, Amazon sellers, and welcome back to the Clear the Shelf podcast with myself and my circumambient co-host, Chris Rasick. This week, we've got Joy Williams from Seller Basics on the show. And Joy and I, we go way back. Joy is actually one of the few people who I know from back when I got started selling on Amazon over a decade ago. And now Joy works with Seller Basics and handles a ton of account health issues and suspensions and things like that. And our goal today is to learn how to be better stewards of our Amazon account health and protect what we've worked so hard for. Now, before we dive in, you guys know the drill. It takes us minutes to prepare for each one of these episodes. So if you take something away from this show, do us a solid and leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform, or drop a comment and let us know exactly what was helpful in the show. That digital high five makes us want to keep coming back and bringing you more interviews and education to make you a better seller. Now let's dive in. Joy, thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Now, before we dive into the plethora of questions that we've got for you, I was hoping you could set the table a little bit. Like, what got you into the Amazon space to start off with? And then what took you down the path of deciding to work on account health and work with Seller Basics?
So I'll tell you, it's kind of a funny story because my starting point in selling on Amazon kind of ties in a little bit to what I do now. I started selling on Amazon in 2012, but in the couple of years prior to that, I was a huge couponer, like extreme couponer, right? And so we did all the Walgreens deals and the registered rewards, and you were ahead of the game before you had anything to do. But there was all this product that sort of came along with that. And I had a friend in that circle, and she sold the items that she got, free with her coupons or practically free on Amazon and eBay, right? And so that's kind of how I started. And about 6 months after I started, unfortunately, she was the breadwinner. Her husband stayed home with the kids, and she was killed in a car accident in the middle of the night. And it was terrible, but it was also terrible because she had a pretty big Amazon business going, but she was the sole person responsible for it. And don't listen, Amazon. We ended up having to hack into her Amazon account in order to get the money out for her husband, same with her eBay, get rid of the inventory, all that. There are so many Amazon sellers that are a one-person show. If you had something happen, I have to have my appendix taken out. I broke both arms. You must have someone who knows how to get into your Amazon account, right? You have to have a trusted person, or you have to leave something for a spouse or a child, that here's how you get in. Here's what you need to look for. Here's what you need to do. Because when something goes wrong in your account, especially now that everything kind of has a 24 to 14-day timer on it, you could lose the whole business and you come back from your surgery or whatever, and it's lights out, right? So if you are running a one-person show, you must have a backup plan. So that's how I started selling. But I always in my business, I ran a very tight ship, right? When I was out of stock on something, close and delete, right? Close and then delete. Those are two separate functions for Amazon. And if you just delete your listings, you can still get violations if you've never closed them. And so, sometimes slow and steady really does win the race, right? And that's kind of what we see now. Every seller, and it's always been that way, wants to be $1 million seller. They want to be a $5 million seller. They want to be a $10 million seller. But they are not, their house is not in order. So it just sort of evolved. I met Paul through a mutual friend through the Amazon space, and it just worked.
Perfect. Well, good. Let's dive in. I seriously, I have so many questions. So the first one is, I know you've reviewed tons. I had thousands written down. I don't know if it's that many, but hundreds, maybe thousands of account health cases over the years. Are there 3 to 5 like specific metrics that sellers should be monitoring daily that you see too many people like completely ignoring?
Too many sellers ignore their account health entirely. When you wake up in the morning, as an Amazon seller, I know that the first thing you're going to do is to look at the orange bars. That's okay, right? I'm never going to convince anyone not to look at their sales first. But the very next thing that you should be doing is looking at your account health. What happened, right? And many sellers, as shocking as it sounds, never read their Amazon emails. We have had sellers who have gotten suspended because they never did their Section 3 review because they never read their Amazon emails. This is also true for Walmart sellers because we also assist Walmart sellers. They're like, I just don't read it all. It's too much. You cannot do that, right? You need to be actively monitoring. And I will give you a tip. When you look at, I don't know if they're ever going to fix this bug. When you look at your app and it says your store is healthy, you actually have to click through because even for suspended sellers, it will say on that front page of your app, your store is healthy, and it's not. So you have to click through on the app. So that's the number one thing. But even before, account health starts with the buying process, right? Because account health is, by that point, the horse is out of the barn, right? And especially now with Amazon's gating requirements and you have to buy 400, it's not the wild, wild west anymore, right? You really have to be evaluating suppliers. And we see all the time, sellers will say, well, this is a legitimate wholesaler. No, it's not. They don't have a website. If I Google the address on the invoice, it's their house in Wisconsin, right? If I look at their Trustpilot, scammers, fake, counterfeit, doesn't deliver, wrong item, dirty, used, repackaged, all those kinds of things. Just because they tell you you're a legitimate wholesaler, you can't believe them. You have to do your due diligence because that's now baked into the Amazon policy. Amazon says they must have a website, right? That has to be on the invoices. They also have to have a strong web presence, and Amazon really does go look, right? So if you Google your supplier and it's, a disaster out there, you shouldn't be buying from them, right? And a lot of those kinds of places just use Word or Excel for their invoices. That is also now baked into the policy. It literally says we will not take invoices that were created in Word or Excel. So account health really starts there. Now, do we see, we've worked on cases that in my heart of hearts, I'm like, there's just no way. You were sourcing from Dollar Tree, right? Which is, frankly, guys, that's not a thing anymore for Amazon. It just says greeting card, baking pan, toothpaste. That's really not flying with Amazon anymore. Does it happen? Yes, we got a seller cleared, and I just thought there was no way. We've gotten a couple of sellers cleared who bought their stuff through Groupon. Also not a good idea, right? These are anomalies is what is important for sellers to understand. You'll also see sellers who say, I've been sourcing from eBay for 5 years. Nothing bad's ever happened to me. That's an anomaly, and it's something bad waiting to happen to you, right? So, you have to remember these are Amazon's requirements, good, bad, or indifferent. This is their sandbox, right? So for every one person in a Facebook group who says they've been doing this bad practice for 10 years, there's hundreds of sellers who've gone out of business.
Joy, we had Paul on the show. It's one of my favorite episodes. I reference that episode all the time. He said that he mentioned that he's brought you in because of your attention to detail and institutional knowledge. Can you walk us through your daily account health audit process and maybe give us red flags that you can spot within the first few seconds as soon as you look at an account?
So the number one thing is when Amazon says low or no impact, you can't, specifically no impact, you can't trust that, right? So sellers who get inauthentic for Nike in particular, or the other, what we call big sexy brands, Nike, Adidas, Converse, these kinds of things. Hey, dude, even though it says no impact, if you do not resolve it, you will, in most cases, lose your ability to sell that brand. So don't trust them, right? Is 100% of everything going to get resolved for every single seller? Absolutely not. Anyone who tells you that it will is wrong, right? But you have to try. And this is where good due diligence comes in and having good receipts and purchasing and all that. But the number one thing that I see a lot of is repetitive violations, right? If I'm looking at your account health and you have, a gazillion used, sold as new. A used, sold as new should be an anomaly, right? That shouldn't happen that often. But when I see it over and over and over again, you're either buying stuff that is beat up to begin with, you're not storing it properly, you're not prepping it properly. That's a big thing that's happening right now. Sellers are just sending cosmetics, in particular, eyeshadow, blush, these kinds of powdered things, off to Amazon with an ASIN sticker on it. Maybe it's in a poly bag. Well, then it arrives, disaster. And here's the thing that happens is they'll get a damaged claim, right? Or they'll get a couple of damage claims. And they will say, well, I only have 15 left. I'm just going to sell through it and then I won't stock it anymore. That's not a solution, right? Because what happens is it is more than likely that at least half of the other 15 people who buy that are going to complain. Amazon does not want to see repetitive problems. And I don't mean like you're going to get authentics here or there. But if you have a problem with an ASIN over and over again, especially if you got cleared on an appeal, right? If you get cleared on an appeal like that, they're going to expect you to do something different. And that sometimes does require you to call back inventory. The other way that sellers kind of get into trouble is relying on Amazon saying there's no prep guidance when you're prepping. Amazon's prep guidance is a safety net, but the policy actually says that you should be, essentially paraphrasing, you should be using common sense, right? And it does say in there, you should be prepping your items so that they will arrive to the customer undamaged, even if no prep guidance is given. And so a lot of sellers will get kind of indignant and they'll say, well, Amazon didn't tell me to bubble wrap it. Well, it's a glass duck and you shipped it there in a poly bag with a sticker on it, right? Amazon expects you to kind of use common sense there. So that is something we look for patterns, right? Whether it's used, sold as new, or expired. Expired violations happen. They can be kind of tricky to resolve, right? But if you have a pattern of expired, I want to see what are those expiration dates. Many sellers do not know what the expiration date policy is. And they'll just say, well, I would use that amount of toothpaste before it expires. Okay. Not nobody, but very few people are going to use 3, 24-ounce tubes of toothpaste in 30 days, right? So there is a certain amount of putting profit over protection, right? There's but the margins are so good, but it's still a terrible idea. It's not going to end well for you, right? So we're always going to look for those patterns first.
Okay.
It's good to know. You mentioned it already. Everyone wants to have that 7-figure store, which I get. It's a nice round number. So for those sellers who are working on scaling, are there some common mistakes that you're seeing them make during growth phases that maybe they're just not paying attention to because their time is so focused on other things?
So that is probably one of the biggest things that I hear is somebody will say, I don't have time to look at my account health. I am busy buying, right? What they're saying in a lot of cases is I am busy putting $250,000 on a credit card for inventory that I'm not paying attention to the platform and whether or not I'm going to be allowed to sell it, right? We see this. Sellers get themselves deep into credit card debt and they're not minding the store. And then when they become permanently deactivated, your life is pretty ruined financially for the next few years, right? And so again, account health is not the afterthought. I always say you have to think of your Amazon business as a house, right? It has a roof and it has all these little rooms. Obviously your roof is your overhead. And then there's storage costs and insurance and payroll and all this. But the foundation of every single Amazon business is the account health. Whether you're selling $1,000 a month or you are selling $100 million a year, this is where the playing field gets leveled for you. And people think, oh, sellers who are selling $50 million a year don't have account health problems. That's not true. They're just, in most cases, they're addressing them. Some don't, right? And then they have the most to lose. It has to be an integral part of your business. And a lot of people just think it's an annoyance. So that's really problematic for sellers. The other thing is when you're scaling, right? And you're chasing, right, the other sellers. Growing your Amazon business is like rolling a snowball, right? If you have ever lived in the Midwest in the winter, at some point you've driven down a street and you've seen this giant 12-foot snowman in somebody's yard. It didn't start out as a 12-foot snowball, right? Because there's no stability in that. They started out with a good, solid snowball, and they rolled it and they rolled it and they rolled. That is how you build a solid Amazon business, right? Very few sellers can go from $0 to $10 million just like that, right? It's a process. You have to like get your footing, right? And people will say, well, they're doing this or they're doing that. Okay, that is true. There are a lot of sellers who do things they should not be doing. But if you get deactivated for it, potentially permanently, they are not going to come in and say, hey, I'm sorry I gave you that bad advice. Let me pay your mortgage this month, right? You have no obligation to other sellers. You have an obligation to yourself and to your family. And you have to kind of keep your eye on that and not worry about what other sellers are or are not doing. Crowdsourcing info amongst sellers has been around since the beginning of time, but you have to use common sense when you're reading it, and you have to if one source tells you to do this, you should double check that somewhere else, right? Certainly with people who've been around a long time, because there is a lot of bad information out there. And there's a lot of incomplete information out there, right? They'll say, oh, you just have to have, if you're sourcing from Ross or TJ Maxx, you just have to have a picture of the tag. So here they come and they go to our portal, right? And here's my receipt and here's my pictures. And it is literally just a picture of the tag. Great. That number ties it to the receipt. What ties it to the shoe? Nothing. There's no picture of the shoe. There's no picture of that tag on the shoe or the baking pan or something. So when people say, in particular, you have to have pictures, we agree if you're going to source from those kinds of stores, but they have to be functional, usable pictures that are going to help your case, right? So when I say misinformation, some of it is just incomplete information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Seems like you're missing the why you're doing what you're doing, right? It's again goes back to common sense. It's like,
but we also see a lot of people who have a ton of violations for stuff they have not sold in a million years. The first suspension that I ever worked on when I joined Seller Basics, their account health was lit up like a Christmas tree. They had 26, I'll tell you the stats, 26 open IP complaints, right? And about 15 inauthentics, and then just a smattering of other things. Not one of those things had they sold in more than 2 years.
Oh, man.
Wow.
The only thing worse than getting an account health violation is getting a violation for something that you are not selling anymore. And I've had this conversation with big sellers. They'll say, well, I have 10,000 listings that are still open from over the years. It would take me forever to close them. Then you should start now, right? Because it gets more complicated with the Section 3 review. Amazon, if you're on the listing, even if you have no stock, you're on the listing, right? And even if here's another thing sellers don't know. If you have closed and deleted your listing, but you have a unit in the warehouse somewhere that's stuck in FC processing, from Amazon's perspective, you are still on the listing, right? And so sellers will say, well, what if there's a return? What if there's a return? It's going to go to your stranded inventory, right? So what? Then you fix it from there, right? And they'll say, this is a one-off. I'm never going to stock it anymore. Then why is it open in 2 years? Because when you get a Section 3 review, and this happens, you haven't sold it in 2 years, but it's in your inventory. So here's your Section 3 review ASIN list, and they're all old things. Now your invoices and receipts say you bought it in 2021. You're going to then have to explain to Amazon why your documents are that old. And if you get a rep during your video call that is not paying attention or is not, maybe understanding what you're saying, it's a little bit tougher sometimes. We have successfully explained to Amazon, look, I failed to close and delete this, but they do expect you to clean up your open listings.
Let's stay on that example for a second. So you said closing a listing, if you delete it without closing, you are still open to account health violations.
Especially
Correct.
if you created the listing.
Okay. So can you maybe expand on what each of those functions are, closing it versus deleting the listing?
So you've seen Amazon uses the phrase remove your offer. That's closing your listing. Okay. Because you'll see them. We see this in the violations all the time. Failure to close Because when I joined Seller Basics, this was, I have said this for years, and people would say, no, and now you were right? They'll say failure to close or delete the ASIN, right? So people say it's the same thing. If it was the same thing, Amazon wouldn't say or, right? And there's a post, I am not suggesting that anyone go to the Amazon seller forums ever. However, there is a post in the Amazon seller forums where Amazon has confirmed you must do both, right? So closing is what Amazon calls removing your offer, and deleting is then deleting it. And it literally takes, guys, less than 5 seconds, right? You mark them as closed, you refresh. As soon as it's marked closed, then you can delete, but they are not the same function.
Okay.
We have sellers who will say all the time, I deleted this listing. How am I getting a violation? Because you didn't close it first.
Okay. So it's a very distinct process, close, then delete.
Yes.
Two distinct steps. What would you say to, and there's a bit of a debate in the OAC Plus that came up just recently. If you close a listing, I know there are some sellers, some very big sellers, that won't delete the listing afterwards. And then others kind of take the practice of closing and deleting, taking both those steps. Is one method riskier than the other, in your opinion?
Yes, if you aren't doing both. So not deleting it, we also have people who are like, well, it's closed, but it's not deleted. And you don't have to have inventory, right? This is something that happens all the time. Sellers, you do not have to put an ASIN in your inventory to see if you can sell it. That's not a thing. You don't have to do that, right? We see this all the time. Sellers will list it. I wanted to see if I could sell it. That's not necessary. You can apply to sell without putting it into your inventory, right? Or they'll say, oh, I put it into my inventory, but then the order fell through. We actually had a seller get permanently deactivated because he did this over and over and over and over again. And then he got a Section 3, and it was a number of ASINs, and you have purchase documents for any of them. Or they'll say, oh, I just listed one because I wanted to test it. And then I was going to run on over to Kohl's or Sephora or whatever and buy it. That's drop shipping, right? That's what Amazon says is drop shipping. If you sell something, right, and then you buy it later, and we've had these cases, you sold it at 10 a.m. on Monday. So at 5 p.m. on Monday night after work, you ran over to Sephora and bought it. If you think Amazon doesn't drill down to the time between the time you sold it and what's on your receipts, sometimes they will, right? And so that's the problem, is stuff that's in your inventory that you never even bought, right? Or stuff that you bought a million years ago and it's still in there. So there's no good reason to not close and delete when you're not selling it. And people say, well, I might sell it again in 2 years, and I'm going to use the same SKU in my reporting. That's just accounting, folks. That's all. You can, especially if you're using something like Inventory Lab, right? Inventory Lab can still tell you how many you sold under the old, FMSKU and how many you sold under this one. That is a 5-minute solution to what could become a permanent problem, right? So for me, that's not a valid reason not to get rid of them.
Interesting. Let me dive just a little bit deeper, because I know one of the reasons people will also add things to their inventory is because they want to see if something comes up as one of those hidden generics, and you get that 566 whatever number. So should those people just be like, listen, you need to, once you see that, like, delete it. Just get it out of your,
delete it and get rid of it. Instead, they will very often instead just move on with their day, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm not kidding. There are some sellers who have thousands of things in their inventory that either they never sold or they sold a million years ago, right? I had a case recently, and I looked at the product that they got the violation for, and it was an ASIN creation violation. So really kind of no harm, no foul. I used to sell this product, and I know it was discontinued like 8 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm like, why is this still in your inventory? Right? People are like, because I'm too busy. You're too busy putting money on your credit card, right? And putting yourself in a position. There's no such thing as too busy for account health. Not in this day and age with Amazon. We don't live there. Mm-hmm. And certainly it's dangerous when it comes up and it is that generic, right? And then there's like, let me just leave that. You can't do that, right? You have to get rid of it out of your inventory.
So you mentioned Section 3, and I kind of want to spend a little bit of time on Section 3. specifically documentation. You've guided hundreds of sellers, if not more, through Section 3 suspensions. Chris Grant, even he got reinstated quickly. I think it was, what was it, over 60 pages was your submission, Chris?
Mm-hmm.
Can you break down the documentation framework or the structure, and basically tell us what makes the difference between somebody who's reinstated from Section 3 in 7 days versus the ones that take months to clear?
So in most are there cases where the documentation is good, the supplier is good, and they still drag on for months for unknown reasons? Yes, that does happen. That's Amazon, right? But, and this ties into what we were just talking about. So some sellers are like, I haven't sold that in 2 years. I don't still have my invoices anymore. I don't have those receipts anymore because that was 2 years ago. If it's still in your inventory, right, you can't do it both ways. You can't start disposing of your purchase documentation and leave it in your inventory. So that is something that happens, right? And if you have no purchase documentation, there's very little chance that you're getting cleared. Every once in a while, I will couch this by saying you will hear about a seller who Amazon agreed to let them show them what supplier they would use in the future. That is like a 1 out of 100 where that actually works, okay? There have been sellers where Amazon has said, well, show us who you would buy from in the future instead, and gotten sellers to go out and spend tens of thousands of dollars on new inventory while they're deactivated and then still said no, right? So there are a few things about documentation. One, you have to know where your documentation is. You have to have it, you have to know where it is, and you have to, is it accessible? Really quick story. Some of you have probably already heard this story, but the person that happened to has given me permission. We spoke together at a conference a couple years ago. She gave me permission to tell this story. 7-figure seller, right? Predominantly retail arbitrage. Her house burns down and takes everything with it. Everything is gone. She has no documentation for her Amazon purchases at all because it burned up in the fire. Okay. She also doesn't have documentation for her insurance company, right? Or potentially, if it ever happened, gosh forbid, for the IRS. She had nothing, right? So you have to have some sort of cloud-based service where your documents are stored. And I had a seller a couple of years ago. I was speaking at a conference, and we were outside to sort of, telling stories. And I said this, and he said, I have a 1 terabyte hard drive. I'm sitting on my desk and everything. And I said, at 3:00 in the morning, when you were trying to get your people and your pets out, please tell me you're not going to be running down the hall to your office to get your drive. There are a million kinds of cloud-based services, and they're cheap, right? Everything should be up in the cloud. And if you do not want to think about, my house probably won't burn down. If you ever want to go on vacation again in your life, you have to be using a cloud-based service for your documentation. I have plenty of sellers who have gotten, to the woods for their 2-week camping trip with no Wi-Fi, right? Hours away from home, and they get a Section 3, and they have no way to get to their documentation. Or this one happens a lot. If you're going on a cruise as an Amazon seller, you must spring for, if you don't have any employees in particular, you must spring for the internet package, folks. You've still got to check in, but you've also got to be able to get to your documentation remotely, right? So if you've not been doing that, it's a thing where you start from where you are, right? And move towards that. So that's the number one thing, is start by your documentation has to be good from good suppliers, right? But also you have to have access to it. But also never hand annotate your original documentation. We see this all the time. Sellers will, here's my Walmart receipt, but I bought 25 different items on there, and I used this receipt once, and I circled it, and I hand wrote on there for this authentic. Now I used a red pen for this item on here. At a certain point, they become highly unusable, right? Because you have to explain to Amazon multiple times, ignore the pink pen or the blue pen, focus on that, and it just spins you around. So you always need to have a fresh original copy. The other thing is, I am not saying this is right, but this is where we are. Amazon now, not just during the Section 3, but often now for an inauthentic or an IP complaint, they want your credit card or bank statement that backs up the transaction. You cannot redact it in any way. You can circle or highlight the transaction, but that is it. You cannot make other annotations. We've worked on cases where sellers have annotated it, right? They're circling the address with an arrow and they're adding annotation. This is what's on my seller account, my home address, and all these things. And then they want to black out everything except that transaction. Amazon will not let you do that, right? And sellers get very upset. I understand that, right? But for a while, for those of you who don't know, like during the height of the big Section 3 that started 2 years ago on Halloween, they were making you log into your bank or credit card statement. And we kind of said, hey, that seems like really overkill and, not great on your end. And they did stop doing that. But you must give them the whole statement. Can't give them the activity report unless it transpired in a statement that's still open. In that case, you can. But you have to give them the whole bank statement, even if the last page is blank. When you get a bank or credit card statement, it'll say page 1 of 2, and the last page is usually blank, but it's still page 8. You must give them that page, right? And it has to be accessible. This is particularly important for people who use Chase. When you download a statement from Chase, either from your bank or your credit card, it will ask you whether or not you want the accessible. There's 2 choices, right? When you download a statement, you have to choose the accessible one. The other one requires a password. You cannot just give Amazon the password. So you have to make sure that your document is accessible without a password. We see that happen all the time. Where Section 3s in terms of documentation get complicated, and this is going to continue and probably get worse, is for sellers whose account is not in their name. And this is usually in a case where, Chris and Chris, they're 2 partners and they're both on the LLC or whatever, they're S Corp. That's a different conversation. I am talking about accounts that somebody bought from somebody, or accounts that are in your aunt's, hairdresser's cousin's name because you lost an account 10 years ago. You have to give them a copy of your picture ID, either your driver's license or passport. For a lot of people who have sort of like bought an account, not part of the business, they're just basically buying the login, right? A lot of times when people buy the account, the seller of the account will say, oh, no, if you need anything, I'll do it. That doesn't last forever, folks, right? They either have moved on with their lives, right? And they're not going to keep coming back every time Amazon wants to see something for them. And then some sellers, of the original Amazon account, they get spooked by the number of things that they have to tell Amazon sort of, under penalty of, right, that they're certifying it is them, right? Or they just disappear, change their phone number, don't answer the phone. You can't get through Section 3 without providing a picture ID that matches the name on the Amazon account. You can't. So that is something that sellers should be aware of, right? And in terms of other documentation, right, they will require something. If you are registered as some kind of business, they're pretty wide open on this one. You can use a certificate of good standing. You can use your EIN letter. And this comes up all the time. People will say, well, I formed my corporation a million years ago. It's an address I haven't lived in. That's okay. This is the one area where your address does not have to match your current address, because you only ever get one EIN letter from the IRS. And this is an area where Amazon's actually smart enough to know that that's the way that it works, right? So there's a number of business registration. If you're registered with your state, you can use that documentation. The Amazon notice, still for a Section 3, still contains an error. This is probably one of the biggest things we see causing people to fail. It says, when it says in the notice, we want your credit card statements for the transactions, okay? But when you go to join the call, it tells you on the screen to upload a copy of your most recent bank statement for the Amazon account. Don't listen to that screen. That's not what they actually want. And I have been complaining about this for like 2 years now. So a lot of sellers will get on the call and they will do what the screen tells them to do, not what the notice told them to do. Follow your notice, right? The other thing is the notice doesn't tell you that for each type of things, there's the ID, there's the business registration, there's your purchase documents. You can only upload one file during a video verification, one file per type, and has to be under 4 megabytes. They don't tell you that. So we've had sellers that we've gotten through a Section 3 where their purchase documents are over 100 megabytes. And we have to bring that down under 4 megabytes. It's not easy. I don't recommend it, right? But it happens. So there are things about this process that Amazon simply doesn't tell you that when you start trying to handle it on your own, it gets ugly pretty quickly.
Thank you for listening to the Clear the Shelf podcast. My magnanimous co-host Chris Rasick has put together a gift for you for being a listener. It's called the Monthly Goal Tracking Spreadsheet, and it's free. The spreadsheet will help you break down and track how much you've purchased, which should be a leading indicator of how much you will sell, and then you'll be able to track how much you've sold as well as your estimated monthly profit on a daily basis. This will all feed into the daily averages so you can ensure that you're on track to meet your goals each and every month. Grab it for free today over at cleartheshelf.com/goal-tracking. Thanks again for being a listener. Now back to the show. Do you think that our Section 3s, are they something you think is transitory? Like once they get through all of the sellers, it's going to be over with? Or is that something that we should expect maybe every couple of years we're going to need to go through a Section 3 to show Amazon, we're doing things by the book?
So historically, I think kind of everybody knows Halloween a couple of years ago was very scary for Amazon. There were thousands and thousands of Section 3s that went out. Mm-hmm. And since then, there have been peaks and valleys, right? If you hear Section 3, in some cases, there's a few here, there's a few there. But when they come, they very often come in these giant waves, and then it kind of settles down, and then they ramp up again. So the first wave, I 1000% think that, the great horror of Halloween was related to the stolen goods matter. But by and large, what most people will not tell you is most of these Section 3s that have transpired over the last couple of years are a spot check. It's a spot check, and it doesn't really have anything to do, in most cases, with the particular seller, right? But it's like an onion. And the more that Amazon has peeled away, and I say this as someone who's worked on thousands of them, the more Amazon peels away at the onion, the more it's been looking a little rotten inside, right? So let's just say that Amazon does this Section 3 for a seller and they're looking at their Maybelline, right? And they say, I'm not going to name the company. Oh, they bought from there, which is not a place that we allow Amazon sellers to buy from. And then just randomly, another seller ends up with a similar, brand. They also bought from there. There are times where then Amazon starts looking who's on. I'm using Maybelline because it really was a real life example. They start peeling away, right? And they start seeing these sellers are all kind of buying from the same place, right? And this is true for even outside of a Section 3. If you turn in purchase documents from Amazon from somewhere that you shouldn't be sourcing from, especially for, again, the big Section 3 brands, Nike. If Amazon finds out you're buying Nike from a place that they do not approve of, they're going to assume that you buy similar inventory from similar sources, right? Your Converse or et cetera probably comes from the same place. So that's why sometimes in a Section 3, it might start out with two ASINs, right? But then those two different brands, they came from the same bad supplier. Sometimes what happens is after the call, the email, which is standard, you guys, very few cases. I can probably think of two off the top of my head in the last 2 years where after the video call, they were like, thanks for participating. You're all good to go. It is standard for them to ask you to email them the very same documents that you uploaded during the call. So that doesn't mean you failed at that point when that happens. That's kind of standard. But what happens is sometimes after the call, when they don't like what they saw, the email notice brings in new ASINs, right? And this goes back to, is your documentation ready? Because you have 3 days to reply to them, right? Sometimes 5, but usually 3 days. Now you've got to scramble to find all that documentation too. It doesn't happen as often, but it can happen. That is generally not a good sign. And so the second thing that happens is they'll start in the Amazon initial Section 3, they'll talk about bills of lading and da. For most of you, that does not apply. I have had sellers who have come to us after the fact that we're not part of our program, right? And they'll get deactivated and they'll come to us. Did you do the Section 3? No, because I don't have any bills of lading. That part of the notice, guys, is for people that it applies to, right? So again, even as long as you have something, you should still try, right? If you know your documentation is either incomplete or from bad sources, right? You kind of go into it eyes wide open. If I get cleared, then great. If I don't, but very often a normal Section 3, the majority of the time, it does require 2 post-call submissions. This is what I would say about that. This is the way that we do it when we can, depending, we've worked on Section 3s that have included like 30 ASINs, right? If you only have 1 or 2, 3 ASINs after the call, when you can submit by email, this is where you should now break those documents up again by ASIN, right? So if there's 3 ASINs, we blend them together because you can only upload 1 file. When you can do it by email, now you can break them down by ASIN. And you can say, these are my ASIN XYZ invoices, my ABC invoices. That does often make the review a little bit easier for Amazon.
It's good to know. You mentioned Dollar Tree, and you mentioned, suppliers that are not good to source from. And we all know there's suppliers on Telegram and Discord and all of that. And those should be pretty easy to, we know they're suspect. But are there any kind of mainstream places that sellers should be really leery of sourcing from?
So I would say if you're, the thing is, people will say, I source at Ollie's. What you should know about Ollie's, especially if you have, if you're a travel shopper or you have shoppers in other states, Ollie's receipts are not uniform across the country. In some cases, I always use Baker's Secret as an example, and I probably always will, because a couple of years ago, they were filing IP complaints. You might buy a Baker's Secret pan at Ollie's, and it's going to say Baker's Secret. I might buy one at my Ollie's, and it says kitchenware or aluminum pan. So this is true of any kind of store that you go to. If it's a new store, before you walk up to the register with thousands of dollars of inventory, you should be doing a test buy. And you should be looking to see what those receipts look like. One of the other things that happens is sellers will source from a grocery store, which is great, but some grocery stores, once something goes on clearance, it no longer scans at the register for what that item is, even if it would have, it's just marked grocery. This is a no-go, right? It's very difficult to prove to Amazon. I'm working on a Section 3 right now, and Amazon specifically, your receipts are not specific to this item, and they're not, right? The other thing I would say is if you get into that situation and you manage to get clear, here's what happens. Sellers say, oh my God, I'll never do this again, Joy. If you just get me clear of this, I'll never source there again. Okay, here you go. We got it done. 3 months later, they're getting inauthentic, and I'll see 2 weeks after they got cleared of that Section 3, they're right back at that store. You will not win Powerball twice, folks. Right? You just won't. If you get yourself in a situation like that and you get clear of it, you really do have to change your sourcing method, right? So if you're going to source from TJ Maxx, Ross, things like that, people will say, well, I have a picture of the tag and it matches my receipt, but there's no picture of the item with the tag on it, right? The pictures have to be useful. Right? So you can have a close-up of the tag, but you should have one where you can see that tag that we're zeroing in on was actually attached to the shoe, and the shoe matches the listing, right? They need to be good pictures. They don't have to be, Picasso, but you can't do a drive-by with your camera and expect that the blurry, inside of a shoe tag is going to get you cleared when you can't even read all the numbers. And I would also say this, a lot of sellers will do things like they're holding the tongue of the shoe, right? And their thumb is covering up half the numbers, or they're not, you got to spread it out, right? You have to be able to see all the numbers. You can't take that picture as a curved, Amazon has to be able to see it. So it's not enough to say I'm taking pictures. You have to be taking useful pictures, right? That's the big thing about sourcing in places where the receipts are non-specific. And I will tell you this, if you are going to source things that are licensed from stores like that, Disney in particular, you should be taking a picture of the licensing area of either the tag or the back of the box, right? We have this problem, especially if there's like a co-branding situation, right? Where it's a Funko Pop, but it's a Disney character, right? On the back of that box, you're going to see that Disney licensing. You should have a picture of licensing that on those tags, because the sad truth of it is there is still a ton of stuff out there to buy, right? At stores, certain trade shows, that it's not licensed. They are in fact knockoffs. And so you want to be able to prove. We worked on a Section 3 a couple of years ago, and it was for, I'm going to say Lilo and Stitch. It wasn't Lilo and Stitch, but something similar. And they had receipts, they had pictures, but Amazon wanted to see the licensing. And when they took the picture of the price tag, there was just enough showing of the, Lilo and Stitch with the trademark symbol that I was able to zoom in and crop it, and we got her cleared. So you really want to be careful about licensed things and having pictures of that when your receipts are not specific.
That's good to know. I want to talk about that video interview portion of section 3 real quick before we move on to the next topic. I know you've prepped sellers for these calls. Are there, and honestly, I sort of got tripped up on a few things, but are there like specific questions that Amazon asks that you see trip up sellers, and how should someone prepare for that call?
So if I said to you, and this might be one of the things that tripped you up on the call, when did you start selling on Amazon? Would you be able to tell me the month and the year? You don't have to know you do not have to know the day, but you must know the month and the year. And sellers will say, I've been selling for 10 years. Here's what you do, folks. You're going to have to go to your disbursement reports. You say, I think I started selling in May of 2010. You go to your disbursement reports, okay? And you're going to put in May 2010. And it's either going to come up with a report or it's not, okay? If it comes up with the report, don't stop there. Go back and set it to April. If you do it to April and it's like there are no reports, great, it was May, right? So that's what happens to some sellers, right? They'll approximate and then they don't verify. So that's number one. That is the fastest way, unless you are an email hoarder like I am. I still have the email for the first item I ever sold on Amazon, right? Which is ridiculous, but I do. And I also know because it was my son's birthday. I know exactly when I started selling on Amazon. So that's the number one thing that trips them up. The other thing, the most important, so at the beginning of the call, they do give you a pop quiz. Now, there are some questions that are kind of standard, but they do mix it up a little bit because of the bad actors. If they stuck to the same script, then somebody on Gumroad would be selling you a bad actors and like, here's what you have to know. The other thing that trips up is who has user permissions to your account. When you're done cleaning up your inventory, go clean up your user permissions, folks. You would be horrified at the number of people who still have user permissions for people they haven't worked with in years, right? So that is something sellers should be cleaning up regularly. If you have, this is something I wish that they would say in the beginning. If you are using a prep center or have a VA, right? You have to have documentation of that. So you need to have your prep center agreement on hand. They're going to ask you during the call, who is this? That's my prep center. Do you have a signed agreement with them? Many of you do not, okay? If you have an onboarding email from them, Amazon has been accepting that. If you have nothing, then today you should be calling over to your prep center and saying, hey, we need to get something on paper. It doesn't need to be a 100-page legal agreement. Their company name, your company name, they're providing prep center signature, wet signature, preferably. And that's it, right? It doesn't need to be complicated. Where it gets complicated for VAs or other remote employees is if you have a VA whose legal name, right, is very long, or they don't use it, they go by Anna, but their legal name, right, is very different from what's in the user permissions. Amazon wants you to be able to prove that you're paying these people, right, that work for you. And sometimes we've seen it where they've asked for, proof, even if it's an employee who's sitting right next to you that like is a real employee. But you have to kind of be able to prove those payments to whoever it was, right? If you're using Zelle, for example, right, or PayPal, and the name is drastically different, that can be a little bit of a hiccup, right? And so I would encourage you to, when you give somebody user permissions, to match the name to the name on the payment, right? Like if you're paying me, right, my name should be the same as how you're paying me. Where this gets a little bit sticky is sometimes what happens is the Zelle or the PayPal or the Venmo might be in a girlfriend or boyfriend's name of your employee. That is something you should try to get ahead of now. You should say, are you able to set up a way to receive payments in your own name? Now, there have been a couple of cases we've worked on where we had this and we were able to prove, right, like marriage certificate, things like that, right? Sometimes Amazon does get a little squirrely. They want absolute proof. But there are ways to get ahead of that, right? And so you need to have those. But the pop quiz is basically going to be, when did you start selling on Amazon? Do you predominantly do FBA or merchant fulfilled? They will, in some cases, ask you specifics, right? They will sometimes say, oh, I see you're selling this MAC blush, merchant fulfilled. How do you prep it? How do you ship it, right? We had a seller that had come to us, it's not in our program, but they failed because the person doing the interview wasn't actually the person running the account, right? So it was a little teeny tiny item and they told, oh, we bubble wrap it and we ship it in a 16 by 16, but because they had no idea what the ASIN was, right? So you kind of have to know what these basic things about your account. What they're trying to root out is really two things: sellers who their account is not in their name, and people using an automation company. Because as you know, we all know, they are really cracking down on that finally. Thank God. A lot of sellers have been burned for tens of hundreds of thousands of dollars from those companies. They're really trying to root that out. Now, do I anticipate, this is not a scare tactic whatsoever, but there's a pattern. Do I think we're going to have it's been a little, knock on wood, it's been a little quiet the last couple of months. They haven't been coming fast and furious like they were. Do I think we're going to see another significant round before we really get into Q4 or very early in Q4? Yes, because that's been the way it's worked for the last couple of years. And you can see by the things that they are doing now, right? The gatings, the whole Brazil mess, things like that, right? As long as we've all been on the platform, Q4 is ripe for bad actors. That's why, back in our horse and buggy days, if you wanted to sell toys merchant fulfilled at Christmas time, you had to have shipped X numbers of merchant fulfilled orders. Some years it had to be specific to toys, right? Q4 is still ripe for bad actors. So this is one of the reasons that they do come down pretty hard on sellers. And the other thing is, Amazon's always the toughest around Prime Day. You will see, whether it's the summer or in the fall, it's very hard sometimes to get an inauthentic claim, things like that, cleared up during the couple of weeks leading up to Prime, the Prime week. And then after that, right, all of a sudden it's like the gates open, right? The heavens open and Amazon's like, here, sorry that you appealed 50 bazillion times. Boom, here, you're cleared, right? So it's the timing of all those things that make this time of year kind of what I call Section 3 season.
Interesting. That's a good point. That it makes perfect sense. The opportunity that sellers get excited about to sell is also ripe for bad actors. That's a great point. Joy, I want to move into IP complaints and brand registry a little bit. Now, Seller Basics, you guys handle IP claims. That's part of the $99 monthly service that you provide. So for sellers getting hit with multiple counterfeit complaints, what do you do to kind of determine whether to fight one or let it drop off? What's that decision process?
There are times where it can be better to let sleeping dogs lie on the brand community. So the way it works for Seller Basics is, as you know, our founder, Paul Rafelson's law firm, Rafelson Law, right? They're one of our partner network attorneys, right? So if you are a member and you get a counterfeit claim, for example, Seller Basics does two things. Once you've gone into your member portal and you've filled out the submission form, which is very fast, we're going to look at your purchase documents. We do require you to give us your purchase documents for a couple of reasons, right? Where did you source from? We're not going to let you go willy-nilly. Here's an appeal, right? And then have you submit your invoice from, right? Or eBay, right? So we try to sort of be a second set of eyes, right? Or it's a supplier that we know that Amazon, if you give them that invoice, you're going to get suspended, right? There are many suppliers that we know that's what's going to happen. Also, so let's just say everything's great. You bought it from a solid source. It's everything's on the up and up. We're going to give you an appeal for the Amazon side, right? To submit with your purchase documents. But our network attorneys are going to reach out to the rights owner. And we do those two things in tandem, right? I know some people will say, oh, well, I couldn't work it out for the rights owner. Now I'm going to go appeal with Amazon, right? Or I'm going to go appeal with Amazon, but we're not going to deal with the right. Not every appeal is going to get accepted. Anyone who tells you that every appeal is going to get accepted is not being truthful. It's just not, statistically, it's not true. Not everything's going to get retracted, but some are, right? And sometimes all the brands, I want to be very clear, I am not defending brands filing these counterfeit claims willy-nilly. I'm really not. But sometimes they really just want to see, where did you get your inventory? And they will ask, and we don't share where you got it without your permission, right? They'll say, if it came from a solid source, that's fine. We'll retract our complaint. And very often they do, right? In some cases, they're going to dig their heels in. You can get your appeal accepted by Amazon. We're always going to tell you, especially if the response to our network attorneys was not great. If you continue to sell, they may file a new claim. People get very mad that Amazon allows that when they've accepted an appeal. Right, wrong, or indifferent, that is what Amazon does. And people will say, Amazon's already seen my documentation. Yes, but a lot of sellers may buy it here this time and there that time, right? So you kind of have to go through that process again. If they file a new complaint, it is tougher to resolve by an appeal. By the time you get to round 3, you can go under, and it's not, I shouldn't say by the time you get to round 3, because we've seen it in the second round, we've seen it go 6 rounds. The more times the same brand files against you, particularly with a counterfeit without a test buy, at some point you can go under risk of deactivation for repeated violations of the intellectual property policy, even if you got the other ones cleared up by appeal. Should Amazon do it that way? Of course not, right? But this is the reality, right? And so there are times where sellers are in so deep with their inventory that they're just going to roll the dice, but they don't know that that can actually happen, right? And then the only way to resolve that is by retraction, the same as if it was with a test buy. Amazon draws that line. If you don't want to get suspended, you have to get a retraction. Well, if a brand has already dug their heels in, right, and you're not going to get a retraction, you can get suspended. So it gets very tricky, the whole Amazon accepted my appeal. Now, if you're working with us, or if you yourself have gone to the brand and the brand's like really adamant, they're not retracting and they will continue to file, this is a judgment call that you have to make, but you have to know going into it, right, what can happen. That being said, sellers who are going wide, okay, I'll give you a real world example. There's a brand called Willow Tree. They make those sort of wooden angels. You see them in gift shops at hospitals and things like that. If you're watching this, don't sell Willow Tree unless you're buying it wholesale, which is very unlikely because they have one authorized seller. Okay. One of our members on a Friday afternoon got 25 counterfeit without a test buy complaints filed against them by Willow Tree. And I know the sellers very well. And I go and I look at their store and I see that they're still on. So Amazon took those 25 down. They're still on 50 other ASINs. And I said, guys, I'm almost more concerned about the other 50 than I am the first, 24. I know where they bought it, right? And I know we're going to get through it. And I said, if I were you, I'd really go ahead and close these listings down while we work through this. And the sellers were like, yeah, maybe, we have dinner plans, 11 o'clock that night, I get an email. In the interim, while they were having dinner, they filed against the other 50. So 75 counterfeit without a test buy. My team and I are just as fast as we can go because you have to do a separate appeal for each one. They have to locate, and they had thousands of units. Was retail arbitrage, and it seems like what happened at the very end of, after scanning unit after unit, the store was kind of like, we're just going to do a bulk. So not every unit has its own line item, right? And they really kind of dug in for a few days. Our network attorneys got it done. We did get so of those 75, Amazon accepted roughly half of the appeals. The appeals, I will tell you, as would normally be, are exactly the same, right? Except for the complaint ID and the ASIN, because they're not counterfeit. Here's the appeal, right? So that just is a good example too of, you can give Amazon the same situation twice and you're going to get 2 different answers sometimes, right? So if you are wide on a brand and you're on all these ASINs and you wake up and they have filed 6 IP complaints against you, right? You might want to you might want to close the other 12 ASINs right now while this is going on, right? Because if you close them, you've removed your offer. It's very rare for an IP complaint to go through on a closed listing, right? So some sellers will even in the face of all these complaints against certain agents, they'll keep rolling the dice. And now it's 18 or 20 different ones, right? So there are some times where it's in your best interest to temporarily close your listings while you try to address these things. And people will say, I just want to say this because I see this all the time. Sellers will say they get so mad that it was a counterfeit without a test buy. Oh, they should be required to do a test buy. That is because they don't know how with the test buy works. So I'm going to tell you. If you get a counterfeit with a test buy, they don't have to prove anything to Amazon except to give them their order number where they ordered from you. That's the bar, okay? Order number, counterfeit. They don't have to say, here, see the difference, this, that. That's it. They just have to give Amazon an order number. If you're not in account health assurance, well, you'll get a 72-hour notice regardless. If you're in account health assurance, generally speaking, you actually get 7-ish. We've seen them go as far as 10 days before you get deactivated. If you're not in account health assurance, usually on that at the end of the 72 hours. The way a counterfeit with a test buy works is there is no appeal, folks. It doesn't matter where you bought it, what your documentation is. You cannot appeal this. You cannot appeal your way out of it. You must get a retraction from the rights owner. So I see it all the time, especially on Facebook. People are like rooting for Amazon to require you to get a test buy. You are rooting for your own suspension. Stop hoping for that, right? Counterfeit without a test buy. And, part of that is, I'm not a lawyer, Seller Base is not a law firm. Part of that is under Amazon policy and under the law, right? People will say, I didn't sell any units. The law says you just have to offer counterfeit for sale, right? If I'm at a flea market selling pirated DVDs, even if you didn't buy any from me, I'm offering counterfeit merchandise for sale, right? So that's kind of how that works. So it's very rare for a test buy to find a way around it with Amazon. A couple of years ago, they told sellers they could acknowledge it and it would go away, right? With no harm, no foul. And they would get their account back. And they did, okay? Those that acknowledged it. And then about 6 months later, so that was March last year, in November, they turned around and suspended the sellers over those same violations. There were two. There was a Lululemon ASIN where the Lululemon bag in the listing, the pictures in the listing were of a counterfeit Lululemon bag. So even sellers who bought from Lululemon got the violation. Now we have some sellers, and a lot of them bought them from, gray market goods. They didn't get their accounts back because we had a case that we walked on for a bog bag. The actual picture of the item was of a counterfeit version, right? So that can happen. The other one was, I'm sure you've probably for sure seen this. People talk about Rise mushroom.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what happened with Rise mushroom, and it's still a hot topic, even though it's been going on for a couple of years now. There were a number of Rise mushrooms, which is a private label brand on Amazon, where the listings were misbranded. And it was like express e-commerce, right? Mushroom, whatever. A lot of sellers got complaints and acknowledged those violations, and then it went away. And then 6 months later, permanently lost their account. And this is where we go back to suppliers, because one of the things that can be a red flag with suppliers, this is so unpopular, but it's true. If these wholesalers, I'm using that term loosely in this case, are really catering to Amazon sellers. In every catalog they have, their website gives you the ASIN. Very often, those are problematic suppliers. Not 100% of the time, but very often that's a red flag. But we actually saw invoices where the invoice has the ASIN and then it says Express Commerce Rise Mushroom Coffee. So the actual misbranding of the listing was on the invoice, right? So you should not acknowledge a counterfeit with a test buy. I don't care what Amazon tells you. They will say it'll go away, you'll get your account back. It's very often the case where, yes, that will happen, but later on, they'll come back and turn around and deactivate you again. What you're doing when you're acknowledging those is to say, yes, this was counterfeit, or there are people who do this with inauthentics. A clear bunch of goose eggs on your account health page is not beneficial if you're acknowledging every violation just to get it off your account health. You've told Amazon that was not authentic Nike or Converse or whatever it is. There are some cases where you should acknowledge it to get it off your account health. It acknowledges that you've read the policy. This gets into some restricted products, which is a very complex area of this and things like that. There are some times where you are better off to tell Amazon, yes, read the policy, thank you very much, than to leave it open and unresolved. But those are very specialized cases.
Can we talk a little bit about brand registry abuse? I know it's something you guys have fought against, and I guess I don't. That's the one thing I don't know a whole lot about. But what are brands doing with brand registry abuse, and how can we fight back against that kind of thing?
Well, so here, unfortunately, brand registry abuse is not what it used to be, because Amazon policy now gives brand registered brands on Amazon greater protection from other sellers selling on their listings. Okay, it's kind of a pivot from what used to happen. And you'll see this now in a lot of the ASIN creation violations. If this is a brand registered listing and it's created by the brand, and you get an ASIN creation violation for it, and you're like, well, it's hooked up to the brand registered store. If they or Amazon is no longer selling the listing, then you can't either. That's a huge shift now in policy, right? Used to be brand registered page was created by them. You were exempt from a lot of this kind of stuff. But now the rule is they still have to be offering it, right? And so sellers will say, well, they're still offering it. I just bought it at Walmart. They mean is on Amazon. So brands will have an ASIN that they're just not selling that configuration anymore, whatever. If Amazon's not selling it or the brand is not selling it, then you can't either. But this also sometimes ties into IP complaints. Amazon is kind of saying now, but did you have the brand's permission, in a way that's different than before? And some brands do use IP as a means of keeping you off the listing, right? One of the ways, again, I'll say this. A lot of times sellers want to think that Amazon is the enemy, but I'm going to tell you, the bigger enemy to a good Amazon seller is bad Amazon seller, right? They sometimes do more harm to you than Amazon does. So here's what happens. And this happens a lot in supplements. Okay. They're brand registered, but they also have a website. Okay. And if you sign up on their website, you can get a one-time coupon, right? And then you use the coupon and you buy the product. And then you get the email with your, order and shipping and delivery, and it says, refer a friend. And your friend will get 20% off. And then they make up an email address for themselves, and then they refer themselves and rinse and repeat and rinse and repeat. Or they're using variations of their name, right? Or variations of their address, or making up names and things like that. So a couple of things happen there. Sometimes what happens is the brand will file a complaint because their fraud detection has determined that you are purchasing from them sort of in these, in a duplicitous manner, right? The other thing that happens is, guess what? Now you have a violation or a Section 3, and your purchase documents have 100 different names on them. You used to be able, and back in the day, to say to Amazon, oh, that was my employee. Now we circle back to what I was talking about earlier. Great, that's your employee. Show us where you paid that employee. And sellers can't, right? So there used to be, for years, it was kind of a business model on Amazon where you competed with the brand and you just waited for them to go out of stock and then have your moment in the sun. And I know there are a lot of people who still think that they still do that and they still think it's a viable method. What I am telling you is these brands are pushing back hard on that, right? And it can be very difficult. I was working on a case this morning where Amazon specifically said, yes, but do you have the brand's permission? In his brand registered listing, the brand's not selling on it anymore, right? So Amazon has kind of shifted because they've gotten a lot of pushback from brand registered brands, right? If you have a brand registered brand, you're doing $50 million a year on Amazon. This is not a popular opinion. It's not. As a seller, right? If we put on our seller hats for a minute, I would expect Amazon to kind of gate my brand. They do make it very difficult for brands because sellers are like, okay, if it's gated, it's gated, right? At least they know. But Amazon lets you get on the listing and then you find out the hard way, right? And so for some brands, they're like, well, I've built this brand on Amazon and I'm, doing all this, but you're letting 60 other people sell on my listing. And so there has been pushback from that side. It seems like Amazon has heard a little bit of that because they are being a little bit tougher on sellers. This is mostly, I will say, again, That is mostly related to a lot of like supplements and specialty products, right? Where Amazon is taking more of the brand side in that regard. It doesn't mean you can't get an appeal accepted. It just means they're a little bit tougher about where you buy things sometimes, right? Do we think it is an abuse of brand registry still when you're buying authentic? Does it fly in the face of what Amazon said? Absolutely. I'm just trying to explain the reality of what's actually happening to sellers right now. So sellers whose primary business model is to compete against the brand and wait for the moment in sun, it is getting to be a tougher road for those sellers. Now, there are sellers who see for every side of this, right? So there are a lot of listings out there that have been created to circumvent that brand registry restriction at the listing creation. That's where you start seeing bad listings being created, right? We see this in the brand field, right? Because again, there's a hill I'm going to die on, and it's not a popular one. If you are outsourcing and you are scanning a listing on your phone, you should be looking at the brand field on a web browser, because very often there are things that do not show up in the app, but you can see them clear as day on the web browser. Either that it's generic, that it's somehow misbranded, right? And this is something that sellers, it's very nuanced. So if this is a bottle of, Ice Mountain water, right? And you want to list on it, the brand field should say Ice Mountain. It shouldn't say Ice Mountain bottled water, 16 ounce, etc. When you see those kinds of listings in the brand field, or it'll have the brand name plus the product name, right? Those listings generally have been created to circumvent the listing policy, right? You should be leery of those kinds of listings. Sellers are like, but that's what it is. Yes, but that's not the brand name, right? It's some of what they make. If you think about Procter & Gamble, right? That's a brand that is an umbrella brand. They have all these other, it shouldn't say Procter & Gamble, Bounty paper towels 6-pack in the brand field. And we see sellers get on those kinds of listings all the time. That's a misbranded listing, and you can get deactivated for it.
Now, for the arbitrageurs out there, how do we know as we're sourcing whether the listing is brand registered?
So you can it depends on which way you're sourcing and what you're looking at, right? So if you see the number one way, if you're looking at a detail page and it says brand XYZ brand, it's generally not under a brand registry store. Anything that says visit the blah, blah, blah store, that's a brand registered listing. That's the quickest way to tell. And so certainly when you're getting these ASIN creations, right, there are a lot of listings, Yankee Candle's a hot one right now. There is a Yankee Candle brand registered store. There are a lot of listings that are not under that umbrella. So if you look and it says brand Yankee Candle outside the brand registry, if you look at it and it says visit the Yankee Candle store, it's under the brand registry umbrella. And also, if you're looking at the listing, is there a bunch of A+ content? Brand registry, right? In most cases. If almost all of the listings are in the voice of the brand, right? That is something else to look out for. If you're looking at a listing that you clearly know was created by a seller, I always use Dunkin' Donuts as an example because we see it a lot with Dunkin' Donuts coffee. Clearly you can tell by the images, these were not created by Dunkin' Donuts or Amazon, right? But the script in the description's like, our strawberry flavored coffee is the best. We make it fresh, That kind of wording has been lifted from somewhere else on the internet. That is a copyright violation. So we see that a lot. Copyright violations, very difficult to resolve, right? So if you're looking at a listing and it's not brand registered and you can tell those images were cribbed from the brand and the description was cribbed from the brand, working on a case today. Last bullet point says, if you don't like this product, right, reach out to us for this warrant, for your warranty claim, right? This warranty is not available from Amazon. There are 59 sellers on that ASIN right now that are not the brand. And here's a bullet point telling buyers, if you don't like this product, reach out to us for your warranty. None of those sellers have any business being on that listing, right? Because it doesn't say reach out to Ice Mountain for your warranty. It just says reach out to us. So if you're looking at the detail page, whichever seller is on there, it says you're going to get your money back. You have to do a little due diligence beyond, is this going to make me money? It's a two-part question. Is this going to make me money, and should I be selling on this ASIN? It is a two-pronged problem that you have. It can't just be that it makes you money. That's a big downfall for sellers these days, right? It might make you money, but if it's a bad listing, it's a bad listing. So those are kind of the things that you want to look out for.
Okay. You mentioned gray market goods, and we talked about Discord and Telegram wholesalers being a major risk. How do you coach sellers to vet their suppliers before they make their first purchase and potentially have their account run amok?
So I want to tell you the big risk, right, is aside from the Telegram and the Instagram, the Discord, and no matter how much we, bang that drum, sellers are continuing to do it. Even if they have a website and you click on catalog and it takes you to see our Discord, that's a no, folks. But other sellers are not a valid source of inventory, okay? Especially sellers who have lost their account or have become gated in a brand. You see it every single day. You could throw a rock in any Amazon Facebook group and see a post where someone is offering inventory for sale, and there's a gazillion comments. People are lining up to buy this inventory. That is not a valid source of inventory. You can have empathy and sympathy for these sellers, for the money that they're out and now they can't sell it, right? But you cannot let that parlay into putting your own business at risk by selling it. This is also true for Amazon sellers who have like this wholesale arm business, right? Where they're buying, let's just say from Mattel, right? They're buying from a solid source, but they are buying it with in many cases, it's the same company name as their Amazon store. Sometimes it's a different company name, but the address is the same. And in 30 seconds on Google, I can tell you what their Amazon storefront is, right? These are not places you should be buying inventory. You both and I know there are some sellers out there and they don't like what I'm saying, but it remains to be true. Once you've given Amazon an invoice, right, this is risky for both sellers, right? If I give an invoice from Chris because I bought some inventory from, Chris's wholesale because he bought, he needed to get to Mattel's MOQ, right? So then he's going to sell off some of that. And his address is the same. Even if you do it once and you've submitted that invoices, you have tied your accounts together for life. For life. You have tied those accounts together by those addresses. And in many cases, those suppliers, if Amazon Googles, which they will, that business name, right, or that business address and phone number, and it leads to their house in Wisconsin, right? Anything that does not trace back on an invoice to a legitimate business, right? That doesn't fly with Amazon anymore, right? And people have to just because a supplier tells you that they're legitimate doesn't mean they're legitimate. You have to kind of do your own due diligence and go look at it. If I'm Amazon, right, and I go Google them, if I see their Trustpilot or their Google reviews are full of complaints about counterfeit, fake, damaged, used, whatever, this does not bode well for you with Amazon. Amazon's policy actually says that their invoice has to contain a website. Many of these places have no website, right? So that's problem number one. Number two, Amazon policy says they have to have a strong, verifiable web presence, okay? So sometimes you'll see an invoice from Joe Seller, right? And it'll say Joe's Wholesale. That's it. They don't even or they'll say Joe's Wholesale LLC or Inc. They don't even have an LLC or are incorporated. They just put it on the invoice, right? You have to look at it from, if I'm Amazon, right, and I'm already suspicious of this, how is this going to look to me, right? And there are suppliers that we worked on a ton of Section 3s for a particular supplier. And when I looked up the supplier and I looked at their Google reviews, and there are hundreds of them, and they're like 1.2, right? And it's all, these were fake. These have been repackaged. This is counterfeit. We see this a lot with perfumes. Guys, where are we buying our perfumes from, right? This is something that It takes Amazon about 30 seconds to see what we see when we look them up. You should feel good when you Google your own potential supplier about what you see. And you should ask them, what do your invoices look like? What kind of detail do you put on your invoices, right? And just remember that many suppliers, certainly the bad actors and kind of gray market goods, before you open your checkbook, they're always going to tell you, oh, I'll give you my entire paper trail, I'll tell you two things about that. The policy says that the documentation must go all the way back to the original manufacturer, even if you didn't buy it from the manufacturer. This may involve additional supply chain documentation. I can practically quote the policy off the top of my head. That's what it says. Most of these sort of questionable suppliers will tell you that before you buy it. And then when you get into trouble, forget about it, right? And so there's are kind of things that you need to think about. What does it look like on paper? What does it look like on the internet? If you're buying Pepsi from the grocery store and you Google Pepsi's address for their headquarters, it does not lead to a picture of the CEO's house. That is just got to be a full stop, right? And if you know they're an Amazon seller and you're looking at their storefront and you're looking at their address on the invoice and they are the same, you are tying yourself to them, right? And Amazon knows that's another seller, and other sellers are not an acceptable source of inventory. That's why they don't let you buy from third-party sellers on Walmart. That's why they don't let you buy from third-party sellers on Target or even on Amazon. And this is very important. Even if it is the brand themselves on Amazon, right? If ABC Cosmetics is a brand registered brand, you can buy from them on their website. You cannot buy from them on Amazon. And I know people are going to say, I do it all the time. Yes. And I work with sellers all the time who lose their account for such, that you just cannot buy from other third-party sellers anywhere. So that's something to be aware of. Even if you're buying, with your Amazon business account, et cetera. You cannot do it. That's a third-party seller on Amazon. That's where brand registry being the big shiny star breaks down from Amazon. Now they're just a suspect of those brand registered brands. So don't do that either.
Joy, you mentioned, sorry, Chris, just one last thing. You mentioned incomplete information before, and I kind of want to throw it back to that. I've talked to other sellers, and it seems like the lines are blurred a little bit on what exactly gray market is. Because I've had sellers reach out and say, "Oh, I thought Fragrance Net was gray market. I thought Ollie's was gray market," and even Chat GPTs and the AIs and stuff, they don't seem clear on it. So, can we kind of bright line define gray market sellers?
Yes, and then I kind of will also explain why there is so much gray market goods, right? So, I was born in the 70s. When we were kids, probably all of us, you remember that you used to get the Sears or the Montgomery Ward catalog. There was a spring, summer, and a fall, winter, right? There were essentially 2 catalogs, 4 seasons in store. Now, there are 52 micro seasons in the retail world, okay? So this is why you go to Kohl's, you find a pair of pants you like, and you think, oh, I'm going to go back and get another pair of those. Well, you better hurry up, right? Because these micro seasons in the retail stores. So what happens is, in most cases, in clothing and shoes in particular, they don't go back to the manufacturer, right? They get liquidated. And there are companies that will buy it, from Macy's, for example, by the truckload, right? And they just take it all. Then what they do is they turn around and resell it, sometimes by the truckload, sometimes by the pallet. It's usually not specific. It's not on the invoice. It's you bought 10,000 units or 10 pallets or whatever it is. And Amazon won't even take a manifest, even if it's manifested. Those goods are now considered to be gray market goods, right? It's this secondary life for the resale of these goods. Sometimes what happens is companies, this is very true in health and beauty and cosmetics, health and beauty in particular, especially if there's like a packaging change or formula change, they will liquidate them out of the country because they don't want them for sale in the US market. Then what happens? The companies overseas that bought them turn right around and sell them right back to Amazon sellers, right? So now they've gone overseas. They've been transported back overseas, which often leads to, a lot of times, it might have started out, this is what actually, I'll tell you, this is what happened to La Mer, right? If you heard people, a couple of years ago, they're like, La Mer is going restricted. I'll tell you why. huge problem with Lumiere, where a bunch of Lumiere had been sent overseas to be liquidated and was being sold back at an alarming rate. These are very expensive, very delicate face creams, right? Most of them are white. Well, by the time it goes overseas, who knows how it's stored? Now it comes back, right? We all know how long it takes stuff to be transported, right? So now the creams and things like that, they're discolored, their consistency is not the same. And then Amazon buyers are, hollering counterfeit. Or people are buying things from overseas suppliers where the packaging is different. It's not labeled for sale in the US, right? That's a whole other thing. That is a whole other thing that is wildly out of control. That's all gray market. Once it enters, sort of the liquidation phase, right? But what you see at Ross and TJ Maxx, a lot of that is also liquidation, right? That's why I'm personally not a fan. Sorry, guys. I know a lot of you do it. I'm not a fan of sellers buying grocery at those kinds of stores and reselling it because it has been through this liquidation. I'm honestly, ingestibles and topicals, everybody's mad that Amazon's restricting it and Walmart's restricting it. But if you knew the reality of what is a lot of what's in the market, you would understand why these things are happening, right? And so gray market goods are not, people kind of like think that gray market automatically means counterfeit, but that's not really, it's that life cycle of it has been moved out of its primary sales, platform, if you will, which is in the retail store, and it's gone into this cycle. And some liquidation companies then sell to other liquidation companies, right? And so on and so forth until it's kind of been moved around a lot. It's not the primary, if you go into Macy's, right, and you buy an Adidas hoodie, right, cool. If you then, it leaves there and it goes to ABC liquidation, right, and then you buy 20 pallets from them, that's gray market, right? It's out of that primary chain of custody, if you will. And there are certain, was it Columbia? Maybe it was Columbia. This was part of one of their lawsuits against, don't quote me, I'm pretty sure it was Columbia. Basically, they were like, look, these are no longer new. We know that we liquidated this, the lawsuit was kind of specific. This inventory was liquidated, so it's not new, right? That gets into the whole warranty thing with we know people like to say first sale doctrine. But there is case law that says if the warranty is a material difference, right? If you don't get the warranty, unless you buy it from the brand, then there's no warranty from buying it for you, right? So that's kind of outside of what's protected by the first sale doctrine. So that's kind of what, gray market does include counterfeit, but it just, in this context, often means it's been liquidated from somewhere else. And certainly in cosmetics, you have to be careful. There are companies that Amazon sellers buy from, and many sellers lost their account in the last year from buying from this one particular cosmetics supplier because they scratch off lot codes, because without the lot code, you can't track the expiration date. They repackage things. This is why, going back to Dollar Tree, for example, if you walk down the cosmetics aisle at Dollar Tree and you see this sort of generic, it'll say Maybelline, but it's like a black and white package just says Maybelline, right? Or whatever the brand is. Those are shelf pulls from somewhere else that have been repackaged. And obviously that whole chain, Maybelline, whatever, they know they were repackaged for Dollar Tree in most cases. But there are companies out there that do this on their own that should not be, right? And so certainly when it comes to cosmetics, I have seen sellers that will put those Dollar Tree versions of that Maybelline lipstick or whatever it is on the ASIN that contains the original shelf packaging. You can't do that, right? And they'll say, but the UPC, this is again where the common sense, the ASIN has to match the item and the item has to match the ASIN and they have to be exact.
Interesting. So I've heard you talk about account health as kind of like hygiene, it requires some regular maintenance. And that's certainly preferable over those late night emergency room visits. Mm-hmm. So for sellers who are, I don't know, sellers are kind of intermediate area. Like what should they be doing every day or week, just as like regular account health maintenance, just to make sure things stay tuned up?
So the first thing is you should at least once a day I'd be a fan of twice a day. You should be looking at your account health page. You should be looking for new violations, but you should also, and this is critical right now, you should be reading your Amazon emails, because over the last 2 weeks, we have seen a lag between the email and the time it hits your dashboard, right? So we have a lot of sellers who will log in and they'll fill out the form and they'll say, I got the email from Amazon about this violation, it hasn't hit my dashboard yet. Sometimes it's a day, sometimes it's a week, right? So you can't forget about it. So you have to just generally be checking your dashboard and your emails regularly. And then you have to kind of evaluate your buying practices, right? Especially if you have a team helping you, right? Take some time and go look at what do those emails look like? What am I getting from this supplier? This is really important for OA. If you are doing OA, you can't just give Amazon the order confirmation email. They want the shipping and the delivery emails as well. If they don't send you a delivery email, you have to click on it and track it and do a print to PDF. Because what happens is if your tracking number expires and you can't prove that you ever got the item, it's very difficult to get through your Section 3. And many sellers do not, because they can't prove they ever got the item. And people will say, I don't want to do all that. Well, and you don't want to sell on Amazon because that's the way it is now, right? I will say people are in this right now where they're like, oh, I think it's tough for a new seller to get into this business. I actually think it's harder right now for sellers who've been around a long time to come around to the new way of doing things, right? And I always say we don't live there anymore. That, when I started selling on Amazon, all you had to worry about was if the FDA had recalled the item. Nobody cared what we were selling. I sold so many over-the-counter products, over-the-counter medications that are now banned by the FDA. Like if they were recalled, Amazon would send you an email, just tell you not to sell it anymore. There was no penalty for it, right? We don't live there anymore. And so sellers that I know personally that came up through Amazon when I did, many of them are having a hard time adjusting. They'll say, but we never had to do that before. Well, times they are changing, right? So it's hard, I think, for us established sellers more so than new sellers. New sellers are coming in. These are the rules, right? These are the expectations. They're like, okay. But it's sellers sometimes who've been around a long time. And in some cases, big sellers. People will always say, oh, it's a bad actor who will do these kinds of things that make it hard for us. Sometimes you'll see an Amazon seller that's doing $20 million a year and they don't have all their documentation. They got lost along the way. They're the ones sometimes who are taking these wild chances with doctoring their own documentation because they're trying to hold on to this and protect this, right? Whereas in most cases, a new seller who's been here a couple of weeks or a couple of months wouldn't dream of it and wouldn't know how to do it if they could, right? And so there's sort of that mix that people are like, well, I'm a long established seller. Why is Amazon putting the screws to me? Because there are sellers who have been around a long time who do these kinds of things. It's not just new sellers or sellers who are located outside of the US. When the Inform Act became a thing a couple of years ago, you would be shocked at the number of sellers who are doing $10 million a year. And the address that they used for their Amazon account when we first had to publish our addresses, it's just a random address in their town because they didn't want to disclose their actual address. And now they can't get through the Inform Act because Amazon's like, well, show me something from that address. And they literally just picked an address in town, right? You probably see these things on the news where things just start showing up to people's houses when an Amazon seller goes out of business, right? Sometimes the entire account was registered in those addresses. So that's why I say sometimes it's other sellers that are a bigger problem than Amazon.
It's interesting. So we're approaching Q4, so this is going to be even more important. But I want to talk about ODR, the order defect rate or late shipment rate, and specifically policy violations. They compound, right? So when you see a seller that has an account that's starting to deteriorate, what would you suggest as a 30-day recovery plan to get them back to a healthy metric?
So the first thing I would say is you really have to, as a seller, this is where, again, profit can't be the driving factor all the time, right? If you have 1,000 of something and you are a one-person show or even a two-person show in some cases, right? You have, for most sellers, you have no business listing all 1,000 of them merchant fulfilled at one time, Okay. Because here's what happens is you never know when something is going to get hot. Certainly now with TikTok and Instagram, right? If you are a seller who has something listed merchant fulfilled, certainly if you have 1 day, in some cases even 2-day handling time, right? And you can sell through all 1,000 units. It happens, right? Can you pack and ship all 1,000 in your handling time? Most sellers cannot, right? I mean, I've been doing this very, very long time, right? During the pandemic, because I sold a lot of grocery during the pandemic, I very quickly in Q4 found out what my limit is, right? I can personally pack and ship around 600 orders by myself in a 24-hour period. But I have been doing it a long time. I knew exactly what, the parameters for what it was going to be shipped in. Some of them were pre-packs because I knew they would sell. But if you just throw your whole 1,000 quantity up there and they sell, what are you going to do? I had a seller last Q4 that approached us. It was in the Facebook groups. I think it's gone now, but I actually think it was at FBA today. So this might sound familiar. They had this huge quantity and it had been 2 weeks and they were still packing and shipping orders because they had listed them all. It's something that went hot. And, 2 weeks later, they're still trying to get all their orders shipped. So this is where it starts first, right? If I could probably get out 200 orders. Great. Then you list 200. And then when it starts getting down, then you list another couple hundred and so on and so forth, right? And one of the things that I always recommend is for merchant fulfilled, I don't care how long you've been around. If you buy 1,000, you don't list 1,000. You want to list 990 until your last one gets delivered, right? Especially in toys, for example. You never know when something's going to happen. You might get down to the last couple and the case on the bottom, 6 of the units inside are crushed, right? So if you list and sell every single unit of every single thing that you have at one time, you're not giving yourself margin for error, right? We've had sellers whose ODR got into trouble because their storage room ended up having a little tiny leak in the ceiling right over the product and it got all wet, right? And so you have to give yourselves a little bit of a cushion there and you have to be prepared. Now, the number one brand that gets sellers into trouble during Q4 for their ODR is Lego. Why? Because Lego boxes are a pain in the foot. Okay. If you have never shipped Lego, there are many Lego boxes that are not a standard size. If you do not know how to Frankenbox, you are going to get yourself in a situation. Sellers will buy these giant Lego boxes and have no idea how they're going to ship them until they sell, right?
Just throw a poly bag on them, right?
Right? And that's all you got to do, right? Yeah. So, you know what I mean? You've sold Lego, you know what I mean, right? Like there are odd shaped long boxes, certainly that are longer sometimes than the game board boxes, right? But this is true for a lot of products. Sellers have absolutely no idea how they're going to ship them, or they are not prepared to ship as many as they need to within the time frame. So let's go back to the example of I have 1,000 units and it's going to ship in a bubble mailer. How many bubble mailers should you have? More than 1,000. One, some of them are going to be flawed. They're not going to have the strip. It's not going to, or they'll say, I have 500 on hand. And when I sell through, start getting low, I'll order some more. You must have the shipping supply on hand for every unit that you have listed merchant fulfilled. Now, this is also where sellers get into a little bit of trouble. If they have something that they don't have the box figured out, and then they go buy a branded box from like Home Depot or Walmart. Sometimes buyers will report you to Amazon and say, oh, this was drop shipped, right? And so you've got to be prepared to ship. So during Q4, we see lack of preparation being a huge factor in the ODR, overlisting being a huge factor. And if you want to spend, a considerable amount of time, in the evenings and on the weekends, attending holiday parties and going to the zoo and all those kinds of things, your family time, that's great. List accordingly, because you can't wake up on Monday morning and you have 900 orders to ship and you haven't even started, right? So that's something too. And sellers who wait too long to take down their merchant fulfilled listings. Okay. If you know that you go to Michigan from New York every December 18th to go to grandma's house, right? You cannot wait until December 18th to put your store on vacation. You will have pending orders that the credit card hasn't been processed yet. You're going to get halfway to grandma's house. You're going to get a ship now notification, right? You have to be realistic in your abilities to merchant fulfilled. It's, if you have 2 pending orders and it's something small, put it in the car with you. Take it with you. Take it on the airplane. You've got to get it out, right? Or have that trusted backup. But you can't come back on January 29th and say, well, I didn't ship those dozen orders, Joy, and now I'm in trouble, but it was time for me to go to grandma's house, right? You're running a business. It is perfectly acceptable, of course, family first, right? But you have to know when to start the cutoff for what you're going to merchant fulfill. Now, Amazon will put you under threat of deactivation for that ODR if you have a very low number. Sometimes what's almost worse is if you only sell a couple of things merchant fulfilled, there's almost no margin for error, right? If you only sold 10 things merchant fulfilled and one of them didn't get delivered, right? Your statistics now are crud. Now, are we able to explain that to Amazon? Yes. Do they sometimes not even want an appeal? It's like a warning shot, even though it says you might become deactivated. Yes. But this goes back to what I was saying earlier. You have to take steps. When you find yourself in one of these positions, do something about it. Don't just keep letting it happen over and over again, because that's where Amazon says, yeah, you're not taking us seriously, so goodbye, right? So that's the biggest thing. Overlisting, lack of preparation.
That's good to know. Let's talk about those people who do miss their regular checkups and they do need to go to the emergency room. Mm-hmm. Someone comes to you with an account suspension. Like, what's the very first thing you tell them to do other than calm down?
Well, that is the first thing. Whether you are in our membership or not, breathe, take a step. So many sellers do what I call the kitchen sink appeal. And this is born out of the sort of the old methodology of you have to have a root cause and you have to have action steps and Sometimes there is no corrective action, right? Or sellers will get these wild appeals off the internet, right? And they will throw in everything except for the kitchen sink, trying to convince Amazon to resolve this. And all they're really doing is opening themselves up to different kinds of violations from Amazon because they've said that they've done things that they haven't done. Okay. So that's the first thing. The other thing is never, ever, 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 I don't care who they are or how long they have been in the space, never, ever let anybody submit anything to Amazon that you have not put your eyes on. Okay. Once something has been submitted to Amazon, like an appeal, very, very hard to unwind. And once you've said it, Amazon's like an elephant. Sometimes they'll forgive you, but they will never forget. Right. And so sellers who, we don't take user permissions. We could because we're, part of the Amazon service provider network. So we have a special wall that gives us, right? We still believe, regardless of what Amazon tells us, that their system is not perfect, right? They've had some technical issues over the years. We don't think that it warrants the risk going into, so we've built a very easy system. But there are a lot of people out there, and certainly, guys, stop hiring people on Fiverr and giving them the login to your account or the user permissions. You should read every single thing before it gets submitted to Amazon, because these kitchen sink appeals are very commonplace, right? And they will admit to all kinds of things, even though you have not done them. So that's the first thing. The other thing is, aside from not panicking, is don't decide what the outcome is going to be, right? So sometimes we get into a Section 3 with a seller and I can't scrape them off the ceiling, right? And so it impedes their ability to respond to Amazon, right? Or again, they get caught up in the nuances of what the Amazon notice says, like, I need bills of lading, so that's it, I'm out of business, right? If you really want to sell on Amazon, even if you think that it's not the perfect amount of documentation or it's not the greatest supplier or whatever, you still have to try, because if you don't try, you will get deactivated and then it is over, right? But it requires you to be organized in the first place and to look at it for what it is, right? Because sometimes, we talked about this very early on, there are some times where the best advice is for you to do nothing, right? And this is where sellers get into a situation where you don't know what you don't know, right? That's kind of the benefit for us is we work with a lot of sellers. We see a lot of things. So I can open an invoice and say to a seller, okay, if you appeal this inauthentic with your documentation, in all likelihood, you are going to get deactivated, and in all likelihood, it's going to be permanent, right? There are some suppliers I know that we've worked with, a ton of sellers that permanently deactivate. They're just on Amazon's no-go list, right? So there are times where the best course of action is to wait and see if Amazon puts your back to the wall, right? If it's a Section 3, you kind of have no choice, right? But if it's an inauthentic, sometimes inauthentics don't get cleared up, and then they fall off in 180 days, and everybody goes home happy. Sometimes you'll get an inventory review. You get those emails, right? And Amazon will ask for it. Many times they don't say, it says we'll destroy your inventory, but they don't specifically include a threat to the account itself. Sometimes you have to just get that 30-day email and do nothing, and then they'll send you one at 15 days and 5 days. But if you bought from eBay and you give that to Amazon, chances are you're going to get deactivated, right? But these are very specialized kind of instances where sometimes it's better to do nothing unless they make you. If it ends up in a Section 3, now it's for all the marbles. So you have to give them that, and you have to try to hope for the best, right? But that's a smaller subset. This is, again, where sometimes it's the misinformation, right? I promise you that the bulk of people who are buying from eBay, or, everybody knows it's not a secret, like, which is now, very inventively that Amazon doesn't take their invoices, right? And I am naming that supplier because that supplier outed themselves on LinkedIn and said, hey, Amazon doesn't take our invoices. We just got off a call with them. So I'm not saying anything that's not known. But if you just have an inauthentic, I'm probably going to say, we're going to probably wait and see, right? Some sellers are like, I just want to roll the dice, and they give it to Amazon. But you may not want to unless they force your hand with a Section 3. Mm-hmm. But it really is about like calming down and being methodical. The other thing is, this is true for any kind of violation or claim. You should be naming your files in a way that helps Amazon review them, okay? We see this all the time, certainly with OA. You've got an order and a shipping and a delivery confirmation email, right? And maybe you place 6 orders. So now you've got 18 documents, and they're all labeled scan 1459, scan 6789. Amazon, I promise you, is not going to open every single one of those documents and read them. And people will say, well, you can't change the file name. Yes, you can. I'm telling you, we do it every single day of the week. It is the ASIN invoice. If you have multiple invoices, follow it up with either the invoice date or the invoice number, right? Same thing with the online arbitrage orders, right? Order confirmation, shipping confirmation, delivery confirmation. Unless there is a need to do it, don't lump everything together. We see this all the time where people will say it's an inauthentic and they will have 62 pages, and it's 62 pages of stuff you don't need to necessarily give Amazon, right? And so unless there's a need to stay under the 20 files and the combined 10 megabytes, you don't need to give all the invoices in one file. Sometimes it's better to give them 3 invoice files, right? It's easier for them to look at, and they don't necessarily always scroll through every page. The other thing is Amazon primarily will not zoom in or out. So, a lot of sellers do not know how to turn something into a PDF, right? So there's YouTube videos and blogs, and they'll show you how to do it. The other thing about that is when you get those emails, right, and there's a little picture of the item on those or the website's logo, always tell Gmail in particular to download the images. We have been able to use those little thumbnails to prove to Amazon that was the item. But if it's all just a bunch of broken images, right, it's not that helpful to you. So take that extra time, and you can say trust senders. So the next time Amazon, Gmail is going to download them for you automatically. Those little pictures can be invaluable.
Interesting. Joe, you've mentioned that apologizing in appeals often makes things worse, which I think is pretty interesting. So what's your framework for crafting appeals
Because here's the thing.
without admitting fault?
if you're telling Amazon, this is not counterfeit, I bought it from a legitimate supplier. And we have cases where Amazon has basically said this in writing, right? If you're disputing it, then what are you giving me action steps for about how you're not going to do it again in the future? It can't sometimes be A and B, right? This is not counterfeit, we do this all the time. There are no corrective actions because in this case, this is authentic, purchase from, Are there times where you need those action steps? Yes, if it was the wrong item, right? This is the other thing that sellers get themselves into trouble. I have a philosophy and I've brought it to Seller Basics and I say it all the time, both in business and in life. Perfection is an unattainable goal. I do not care how diligent of a seller you are. Perfection is an unattainable goal. And this is going to be earth-shattering. People are going to be blowing up your comments. Buyers are not always liars. Buyers are not always liars, folks. When you get a wrong item received. So when you get a wrong item received and they'll say, I ordered the pink one and not the blue, and I got the blue one. And we'll say, for a wrong item received, we'll ask you for your VOC and or your return report. And I will see order after order after order. I ordered the pink, I got the blue. I ordered the pink, I got it. This is the most underutilized tool available to sellers is your VOC, right?
For those who don't know, that's voice of the customer.
Yes. Invaluable piece of information. So I'll see it and it's complaint after complaint after complaint. And yet the seller's submission to us will say they just want it for free. They're lying, right? And I look at their VOC and their return report and it's one after the other. Accidents happen, whether you're prepping your own inventory, using a prep center, sometimes things get mislabeled, right? Sometimes listing detail pages get changed, right? The images get changed to a different color, the size gets changed, things like that. You can't assume that every complaint that you get from a buyer is because they're trying to scam you. And I know it circulated recently on Facebook about how you cannot talk to Amazon reps any way you want. You also cannot talk to buyers any way that you want. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you think that you're being scammed, you cannot send a message to a buyer telling them that you think that you are being scammed, unless you would like to kiss your Amazon account goodbye, right? Amazon monitors those. And if they don't catch it, sometimes buyers will report you. You cannot do it. Even if it is clear that this is a bad actor, they're not perfect, but there are things within Amazon that allow you to report these buyers and the safety claim and all that. It's not ideal, but we have worked with plenty of sellers who have said whatever they thought they wanted to Amazon reps or to buyers and then gotten kicked off for it, right? So you have to kind of put that away and say, okay, this is how I'm going to handle this. So the first thing is when you get these kinds of complaints is it possible that there was an error, right? And one of the reasons we look at the purchase document, many times we have to say to a seller, okay, you listed on the 48 ounce, but you bought the 24 ounce, right? This actually isn't. And then we craft the appeal to be appropriate to the situation. If the buyer says, I got a size 7, but I ordered a size 6, if I see on your order from Nike that you ordered the same shoe in both size, I'm going to look at your VOC. Is this the first complaint? Are there multiple? And say, or if I don't see both, I'm still going to ask you, did you buy it in the other size? Because it might be on another receipt, right? Because these kinds of things happen. But going back to buyers or sellers will sometimes say, well, I'm just going to sell through the rest and hope for the best. I don't want to pay for the return shipping. You're playing with dynamite there, right? When you know there's a problem, you have to call it back and you have to fix it, right? So that's the thing that happens for a lot of sellers is that they just assume that they're right all the time.
Mm-hmm.
It just can't be. That's not human nature, right? The other thing is sellers really, especially if you have seller friends, a lot of sellers have seller friends. Go ask your seller friends, even if it's struck through by Amazon, to go look at your feedback and ask them, would you buy from me? Amazon striking through feedback reveals a lot of patterns. I see this all the time, especially in shoes. Buyer complaint after buyer complaint. The box was all beat up. It only had half a lid. It was a cut lid. It was this, it was that, And a lot of sellers, this isn't because it's been bought and returned and Amazon beat it up. They bought it that way, right? And then they sent it off. And if you can evaluate yourself, but certainly have one of your Amazon seller friends take a look. Just because Amazon struck through it, that doesn't mean that it doesn't still hang about back there. So when you get these used sold as new, just because Amazon struck through 20 of them where the customers said that they thought that it was, used, Amazon still uses that data to evaluate whether or not there was a chance you sold a used item, right? So you can't rely on Amazon striking through bad feedback. It's not a hall pass.
That's good to know. Okay, so we know that sometimes, and this is happening in ungating, it's happening, with suspensions, with IP complaints, stuff like that. Sometimes you just get rejection after rejection after rejection. Is there some sort of escalation strategy that sellers should be aware of?
Not really. I mean, I will tell you, there are some things that some sellers will say have been successful. Submitting pictures of what they received along with the invoice, or, maybe the shipping label that shows it came from, let's say, Nike or whatever, right? There are some tips and tricks, but for every one person who manages to find a way to get ungated, there are hundreds to thousands who will not. And Amazon's position is, that's why we don't address ungating. The only part of ungating that we really focus our, services on is if you become gated as the result of an inauthentic, for example, right? This happens. People, if they don't respond and then now they became gated because Amazon said it was no impact, which is why I always caution sellers about that, right? Once you pass the 180-day mark of that account health violation being on your dashboard, if you do not get it resolved to get ungated, that gating is usually permanent. So it's very important to deal with those. But this gating and ungating, Amazon makes these decisions at their sole discretion. And it's going to be tough right now because it's always tough at this time of year, right? We're into that Q4 thing. And because some of these brands are coming back to sell on Amazon directly. Amazon is spending more of their own money than they used to. This is another area where longtime sellers are having trouble kind of getting with where we are now. Back in the day, and not that far along, ago, over 60% of what gets sold on Amazon is sold by third-party sellers, meaning we were the ones as sellers opening our checkbook to fill the shelves that Amazon wanted filled. Now Amazon is opening their checkbook more than they ever have as long as I've been in this space to work with brands like Adidas and things like that. And, L'Oreal and all these things that have gone gated. That didn't used to be the case. They didn't want to spend their own money. They wanted us to fill the shelves. Now that's kind of shifted, and Amazon is doing more of this direct, where they're becoming the seller. And part of that, unfortunately, is some of these gatings are related to bad seller behavior. La Mer is a brand that went gated, right? I mean, the number of violations that were going out for counterfeit and used, sold as new and things like that, and there are certain big brands that were caught up in the stolen goods matter, right? Shark being one of them, right? Many sellers bought Shark vacuums from those stolen goods suppliers and were selling them on Amazon. And they turned out to be used and refurbished and things like that. And I am talking about at a volume. One seller came to us and had 250 used, sold as new complaints related to these Dyson vacuums. And it was just a disaster, right? So there are some, Dyson, Shark, some Ninja products, there are some brands that were so caught up into the stolen goods. And the same is true in a lot of the cosmetics and health and beauty, right? At the beginning of this year, there was a news story. This woman was running an Amazon account and she had people all over the country stealing from Ulta stores for her. She sold $8 million worth of stolen goods on Amazon. And, we see people come to us all the time. So one of the things that we do differently than a lot of other services is if you're not a member and you come to our website, let's say you're already suspended or on a threat of suspension, you cannot just push a button on our website and pay our pre-existing fee. We vet every single case that we take, and part of that is I have to see your purchase documents, right? One, because we do not take cases that we do not think that we have a good chance of success. Sellers are already in a bad position, right? We're not going to ask them to take the $2,700 that maybe that's next month's rent, maybe that's, the fee, if we don't think that we can help them, And there are a lot of cases where I know I can't help you based on where you sourced from, or, the documentation, or I know that it's a brand that Amazon there's like 3 places they might accept, and that's not one of them. So that's kind of how we operate there, right? And so I see sellers, and if the seller, honestly, I can usually spot a fake document at 100 paces, right? But I had a seller very recently, very upfront. They were like, I know that Amazon doesn't accept the supplier, so I had somebody on Fiverr create an invoice, and then Amazon said, okay, well then give us the credit card statement that backs it up. And so she had somebody on Fiverr make her an American Express statement. And I got to tell you, it was a pretty good fake, right? And so of course we can't help you, right? But you have to know that sellers, like, they do these things, right? And so we're always going to look at that purchase document, and there are people who bought from the stolen goods suppliers, know that one of those stolen goods suppliers changed their business name, not by much, and then moved from the East Coast to the West Coast. They know that they're caught up in this whole thing, and they continue to buy from them. Many sellers continue to buy from them, right? This is where other sellers are not your friend, right? And so they're still selling these big, sexy brands, and they're coming in from these sort of, suspicious places. There are millions and millions and millions and millions of products and brands out there, right? And sellers are very tied to, we'll use Nike as an example. And I say this with all the love in my heart for the Nike sellers. Nike's low-hanging fruit. You can't throw a rock in any direction from any part of this country that you can't buy Nike, whether it's at Kohl's or an outlet store or the Nike store, or Foot Locker, or wherever. In terms of being able to find a source that sells it, it is low-hanging fruit. And so what happens is a lot of sellers fall into the trap that 100% of their business now is Nike. And then they get restricted and they can't get it back. I don't care what brand it is. Unless it's your brand, no seller should be that heavily dependent on one brand in this business ever, under any circumstances. Because at any point, the brand can put the hammer down. Amazon can put the hammer down. You have to have, now more than ever, you have to diversify, right, your inventory. And there are a lot of sellers, Nike in particular, who that's all they sell. We don't live there anymore with Amazon.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting. All right. So we always try to end these with a bit of a lightning round. So if you could teach sellers one thing about, being better about maintaining a good, clean account health, as good as you can, because we know there's no perfect, what would it be?
Good sourcing, solid documentation, storing, processes, and paying regular attention to their account health. And as I said, going and look at your own feedback. A lot of times your feedback gets struck through because it was FBA and you don't even know it happened. Mm-hmm. If you go look at it, you're like, what happened there? Right? You never saw that because Amazon struck through it.
What's your go-to resource or tool for account health management that most sellers don't know about?
Oh, you mean aside from us? No. Your voice of the customer. Honestly, your voice of the customer is the most underutilized tool that you can imagine. That and your return reports with the customer comments included, right? Certainly now that Amazon has this wackadoodle thing happening with these, they're issuing a lot of used, sold as new, defective, and wrong item received complaints, but the VOC all have something in common, which is it's about fit. And there is a new category for account health violations now, and it is fit issues, which is ridiculous and close and choose because that's the nature of it. And we have a great success rate in pointing that out. Like, this is a fit issue. That's the VOC. But you can head off issues sometimes by really looking at your VOC, even if it's once a week. You should be going and looking like, why is this performing poor? And go see what the customers are saying. This happened to me several years back with an LOL ball. My prep center mislisted it. And so, the big ones have a different price than the smaller ones, and they cross-listed them. And I was able to get ahead of that after and it was just 3 comments. I didn't get any violations. It was just 3 comments in the VOC, and I shut them both down and I called them back. If I wasn't paying attention, I could have had a whole bunch of complaints, because the last thing you want to do is make a mama or daddy mad at Christmas time.
Mm-hmm. How dare you ruin Timmy's Christmas?
Exactly.
What's and this one's a little off the beaten path, but we get some interesting answers on this one. What's a purchase that you've made under $500 in the past year that has either been impactful on your life or your business?
I'll tell you, I wouldn't say it's this year, but over the last couple of years, prior to probably the last 2 years, I was not a Walmart Plus, Target 360. As an Amazon seller, you'll find this hard to believe. I really never used my Prime. I'm an RA girl at heart, right? I love the, retail. I was not one to have things delivered to my house in any way, shape, or form. I don't go to the store if I have to go to the store for something now, I'm not happy about it, right? Like, I'm not happy. The amount of time that you save for these little, I'm not talking about ordering DoorDash 3 meals a day, right? You'll go broke. But these convenience, right? Things that have improved the quality of my life, that have given, people talk about your time back, right? There are things in life that you don't necessarily have to do for yourself, right? I think everybody should spend a little bit of money on self-care in a way that is not related to, that is a convenience, right? You should allow yourself something that just makes your life easier, whether that's somebody to come in once a month and do your baseboards or deep clean the house or things like that, right? Let somebody detail your car. Don't be out there with your dustbuster doing it yourself. Just those little things I think are really impactful. And you go, God, I was wasting so much time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good one. Joy, what's a book or podcast or even a video or something that you've been recommending because it has substantial impact?
There are a lot of sort of old school people that over the years, I still love Gary Vee. I will tell you, I still love Gary Vee because I still think that, those little nuggets that he gives, and over the years, certainly as an Amazon seller, probably the most quoted person in this space that I've quoted over the years is Chris Green. When I got into this space back when, Chris Green's retail arbitrage books were popular, and he sent me one. He said, stay away from sexy. And for years, I stayed away from sexy on Amazon, and nobody minded my store, right? Nobody cared that I was selling their cleaning products and their sponges and all these kinds of things, right? So I think that there's that. I try to stay away from, and I think that a lot of Amazon sellers should stay away from, some of the things that you'll see on Instagram in particular, I think can be dangerous for Amazon sellers. Certainly if you're questioning whether they're a good wholesaler, they'll be like, here's our warehouse, and they're showing this picture, and you Google Lens the picture, and there's like 4 other places showing those same pallet racks with boxes, right? Then So I always listen, I try to keep my head down and see what is going on in the space, right? I will go to different kinds of Amazon groups. I'll watch different YouTube videos and podcasts to sort of see what are the trends and the commonalities that are going on out there. But also, this is something that someday Perry's going to be watching this and say, you have to ask me again for the name of this book. Perry Coughlin, if you are running an operation with employees, there's a book, I don't know which one off the top of my head, I'm sorry, but it's about you can't drive your bus if you don't have the right people in the right seats on the bus, right? So a lot of sellers struggle with, when they grow, the HR aspect and the team. You may really like somebody personally, but they just may not be a fit for your business, right? So for sellers, learning to navigate that part. And I think it's really important for every Amazon seller to understand basic business accounting and financial principles. Certainly, the worst piece of advice you'll ever get as an Amazon seller is people who tell you to not pay yourself for the first year and reinvest every penny into your inventory. At the end of the year, many sellers never made a dime, right? And now they're out of business. Pepsi does not spend every penny that comes in the door. They have a reserve. You should have a reserve, right? So those are the kinds of things I think that's an area in the Amazon space that is sorely lacking, is basic education about these business principles. And there's the misinformation about that, about reinvesting every single penny into inventory goes back over a decade, right? So I think all Amazon sellers should find a good podcast or good course about basic business principles.
last thing, people want to learn more about Seller Basics. They want to follow you. Like, where should we send people who listen to this?
So we have a Facebook group that is open to all Amazon sellers. You do not have to be a member. And I will tell you, it's just Seller Basics, right? And our group is not used for marketing our services. Okay. You will not see that in there. What you will see is we use it as a place to, the same way we use our Instagram. You know, you don't see my team on there dancing and like sign up now. We use this as a place to warn sellers about things that are going on in the community, right? And so, or things that we are seeing trends in types of violations, things to be, you know, it's like an educational and an announcement sort of space, and not for, the other thing we don't use it for is individual cases. We don't think that it's ideal for sellers to put their private information into the Facebook group to try to, you know, general questions are one thing, but individual, you know, I got this complaint, because the internet can be a terrible place, right? And screenshots. And so that is open to all Amazon sellers, whether you're a member or not. And on our website, sellerbasics.com, you will see on the right-hand side, there's an inquiry form, right? There's a sign up on the left. There's an inquiry form, right? This is where you can send us a message and say, hey, I'm deactivated, or hey, do your services cover this? And then there's a members benefit page, right? And that's sort of set up to show you, like, on the account health team side, these kinds of things that we help with. These are the kinds of benefits that you get through our network attorneys, right? Like, everybody loves Paul because Paul's amazing at what he does. What do you get as a member? You can have a free consultation by phone with Paul, right? Maybe, because remember, Paul's also, you know, a tax attorney, right? Maybe you started selling on Amazon as an individual seller, and now you're like, I need an LLC. Should I get the LLC in the state where I live? Should I use Delaware or Wyoming? You can have a call with Paul and ask him about these kinds of things, right? Maybe you're a private label seller and you have questions about Prop 65, right? Schedule a call with Paul. So there are, you know, maybe you're a seller and you are kind of, you know, once you become a member, right, you can have account health calls. Let's just say that you're like, I don't know, I haven't been doing this very long. I think I'm on the right track. Am I? You can have a call. I'll get on the phone with you and say, yes, it's a good practice. It's not a, you know, good practice. Or maybe you've already got some violations, right? And we need to get on a call and sort of start walking through some of what's going on, right? So those are, you know, our Instagram too is a place where we post warnings. It can be a little tougher on Instagram because of just the restrictions on size and characters and stuff like that. But on our Facebook group, which is different than our Facebook page, I do kind of neglect the public facing page. Just in the group, though, is a place where we're going to keep you posted about things that are happening and try to teach you some best practices that are a little trickier.
Perfect. And we'll have links to all of that down in the show notes. And we always try to end with a quote. And Chris gathered all these ones this week, but you know, Benjamin Franklin is perhaps my favorite founding father. At least the one who had maybe led the most interesting life. And he said, "An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure," and that seems to kind of be a thread that was sewn throughout this entire episode. And so that's what we'll end the show with.
That's one of our company mottos.
Nice. Joy, this was a pleasure. Now, I know it's not something people want to deal with, but it's certainly something people need to talk about. And so thank you for spending the time with us and educating us on this.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. All right, guys, that's the pod. We'll see you in the next one.
Thanks for listening to Clear the Shelf with Chris and Chris. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a screenshot on your phone and share to Facebook, Instagram, or your favorite FBA group, and be sure to tag me and let me know why you liked it and what you'd like to hear more from us in the future. Also, I'd like to give you some free gifts for listening. Head over to rabbittrailchallenge.com and repricerchallenge.com for some free courses to further your business. Thanks for listening.